Hi guys, it's Olivia here from Olivia's Catastrophe, and today I'm here to give you the third and final part to my explicit scenes discussion videos. So as promised, today I've got 4 different booktubers here whose channels I personally love, who will be coming to talk to you about this topic and sharing their own thoughts, because as much as it's been great to hear what I've got to think, and as much as I've loved discussing with you guys in the comments, it's always great to bring more people in on the discussion. So first off, we have Ashley here from A Frolic Through Fiction, and she's going to be sharing her thoughts.
Hi everyone, I'm Ashley from the channel and blog A Frolic Through Fiction, and I read quite a lot of fantasy books. And when it comes to reading about sex in fantasy books, I feel like it goes either one of 2 ways. The first way is that it's set in a world where rape is completely normal and people just accept that, or it is idealised massively. Obviously neither side of that representation is inherently good because it doesn't show the normal side of things. I feel like a lot of the pressure when it comes to talking about good representations of sex comes down to contemporary books because that is the normal side of life. Like I said before, it's not necessarily a case where it just isn't written into fantasy. I feel like more and more nowadays sex and explicit scenes are a part of fantasy books, but I just think that it's not written about in the best way. I mean, this is obviously from my experience because I obviously haven't read every single fantasy book out there, but from what I have read, it tends to be written about in quite an awkward, metaphorical way. For example, body parts tend to become swords in sheaths and steel wrapped in velvet, which is just not what it is. And I'm not about to sit here and start policing how people write, and I'm not a writer myself, so I wouldn't have a clue how I'd go about explaining the situation. But I just don't think writing about steel wrapped in velvet is the best way to go about it, because I just feel like that still adds a layer that's blocking you from normalising sex. It's almost as if the author is still quite uncomfortable about writing about it, and so they try to create this metaphorical scene in which they don't have to actually say what's happening. I do think there's a problem as well with fantasy books that include sexual scenes automatically being categorised as new adult instead of young adult, because, I mean, you start learning about sex education in classrooms from young teens, like early teen stage, and sex is pretty much referenced in everyday life in regards to the media and just people's conversations, so it's not as if young teenagers don't know what's going on. I mean, maybe it should be based off how explicit the scenes are, but I don't think that it should just automatically be taken away from younger teenagers, because that is only going to raise the taboo and the stigma against it. And I feel like books are quite often used as a safe place for young teenagers to explore different interpretations and different people's stories, you know, read about perspectives that aren't necessarily their own. And so they might want to read sexual scenes in books as a way of hearing about it more without wanting to ask other people about it because they might not be comfortable about that. So books would kind of give them that safe place to read about it. And yes, of course, there's going to be an argument about what good representation is versus bad representation. The teenagers might read the wrong thing and get the entirely wrong idea. But the only way that we're going to get more good representations out there is if they're talked about more, and if it's just written more of without being an uncomfortable, idealised version. And of course people's idea of what a good representation is going to change depending on that person. So we do need different types of sex scene in terms of consent and who it's between, what that person's feeling. It's just, it is a very tricky topic because there's so many things to take into consideration. But like I said, the only way that we're going to get more good representations of that within fantasy, and across all book genres really, is if we talk about it more.
So I totally agree with what Ashley said about the metaphorical talking and language surrounding sex. We can't have that. It needs to be very straightforward and clear cut. And I also really like what she said about how young adult fantasy can include sex scenes too. I mean, if contemporary can do it, young adult can too. Of course, we just have to be careful with how much we're showing to what age group of teens, and maybe age suggestions on the backs of teen and young adult books would be a good thing, so parents better know which age within the young adult spectrum the book is, you know, targeted for. So next up we've got Jade from Jaded Reader, and she's going to be sharing what she thinks about this topic.
Hello, I'm Jade, and I've been asked by Olivia to speak on some of these topics that she's talked about in this video. I'm so honored to be asked to speak on these topics because I think they are really important, and Olivia has asked amazing questions. So Olivia's question is, if rape is mentioned or referenced in a fantasy novel, do you find it unrealistic or do you enjoy the book less? Should fantasy worlds include rape because they are supposedly more ideal worlds, and therefore rape shouldn't exist in them? I've seen this debate in quite a few different platforms, and I definitely have my own opinions on it. Now, my personal preferences are that no, I do not dislike a book for having rape or sexual assault in it. However, it is all about, for me, how the topic is dealt with and if it's being made a spectacle of versus part of the actual storyline. I think writing fantasy is more than writing about ideal worlds. I think it's writing about our topics within our world in a different frame of mind or perspective, creatively sorting through different topics, and I've always found that shoving something under the rug because you feel uncomfortable over it has never worked out. So in my personal experience, opening up the topic in a delicate and caring way, making sure the author has done actual research, listened to actual victims' testimonies, or understood where those victims might be coming from, or have dealt with sexual assault themselves, can be a really good start in discussing a topic without it being just for the sake of impact. I think open dialogue and open discussions and understanding of these topics is ultimately, for me, the best way to go, and I hope that I gave some sort of an accurate response to my opinions. For now, that's all I have to say, but thank you, Olivia, again for allowing me to speak on these topics.
Okay, so I think what Jade is saying is very important for authors, and they should really take note of it. Research, research, research. It's so key when it comes to any aspect of your novel, but especially when you're dealing with sensitive topics. And there are lots and lots of sensitivity readers out there, especially on Twitter, who are happy to read your book depending on what sensitivity you need. So if you need to check person of colour representation is done well, or if you need to check rape representation is done well, there are people who are willing to read your book and make sure that representation is accurate or is unoffensive or is handled in a sensitive and understanding way. So yes, sensitive readers and lots of research is definitely the way for authors to go to make their books the best they can for their readers. And up next we've got Cara, who reads a lot of fantasy, and she's going to be talking about her thoughts on this matter.
So I read a lot of fantasy, and in my time of reading fantasy, I have read quite a few novels that use rape or sexual assault in some way. One of the arguments we see in favor of including sexual assault in fantasy novels is that it makes the story more realistic. I think there may be some truth to that claim if you have set up your world as a clear parallel to our world with a lot of the same societal issues, but I think that there are a couple of things that are important to remember when writing sexual assault into books. There are pretty much just two things that, in my experience, make it feel like a real and necessary part of a book rather than just shoehorned in for drama's sake. And that is that it has to be used for a purpose, and it has to be done in a compassionate way. Now what I mean by that, by using it for a purpose, not in terms of a shortcut to character development. I mean that there has to be a reason in the book, like a larger social commentary issue or something that the author is trying to communicate and work towards the betterment of by using sexual assault in the book. And then by compassionate, I mean that the author has to really truly consider how their portrayal is coming across and how it might affect readers, particularly readers who may be triggered by that sort of thing. It has to be portrayed as an important and horrifying thing that happens to somebody, but it also shouldn't be the defining characteristic of that person's character. And one of the examples I think that did this very badly was Bitter Greens by Kate Forsyth. Of the 3 or 4 female main characters in that novel, every single one of them had some incredibly traumatic rape experience in their background that set them on the path they ended up at, or sometimes was just thrown in for no reason. For example, sexual assault was used as the motivating factor for why a character turned into a villain, and in another case, it was used for basically no discernible reason, but in all cases it was used in such a casual and callous way that it felt like the author didn't really understand how to write women unless they were being raped, and that was not okay with me. And also, if we're going to talk about the realism issue, it's pretty upsetting to me that we can accept dragons and magic and all of these other things in our fantasy novels, but we can't accept women being treated as something other than objects. I think that fantasy worlds should definitely have an internal logic, you know, they should make sense with the way the world is set up at the beginning of the book, but if we're going to start arguing realism, then I don't think rape should be the first thing that we include in the world building of a world. I have never in my life finished a book and thought, you know, it was good, but I would have liked it if there were more rape in it. So even if it means sacrificing some amount of realism, even though I'm not 100% convinced that that would be true, I'm willing to get rid of that in order to not be so constantly bombarded by these images of women being raped in order to further their character development more easily, or just to add some sadness and drama to the book. I've also seen some people who take the opposite approach, in that fantasy should be an ideal version of our world, so that we shouldn't have things like sexual assault or rape in them, because that shouldn't actually be part of our world to begin with. And while I think that this argument to me has more merit than the previous one, I do have some issues with it, because I think that one of the incredible strengths about fantasy as a genre is that it reflects some of the aspects of our world that are sometimes hard to see, or that we almost get desensitized to because we have been living among them for so long. I think it's really important that fantasy worlds still show hardship, and especially they show bad things that happen in our society that people need to actually fight against and work towards eradicating. So I don't think rape and sexual violence should be off limits to fantasy novels, even in YA. I think it should be handled in a very clear and specific and compassionate way, and that it should never be used as a substitute for a character development or backstory, or as a plot twist or a shock factor.
So I completely agree with Cara, and she says a lot here, but I just want to focus on what she says about the rape scenes having a purpose and how she explained that. I really agree with what she's saying, and I just want to note that it doesn't have to take over the plot if you want it to have a purpose. You can still very well unpack a rape scene and rape, but also have a separate, entirely separate plot. I talked about Rhapsodic in my last video, and I think that does that incredibly well if you would like an example. And I also agree with what she says, fantasy books don't have to have rape in them. It's not like a necessary element. You don't have to force yourself into the conversation, but in a similar way, if you do want to open up that conversation, you don't have to exclude it completely. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Serena from A Wandering Mind, and she's going to be talking about her thoughts.
Hey guys, it's Serena from the channel A Wandering Mind, and honestly, I have not read a lot of young adult in which there were a lot of sexual scenes in it. I have to say though that I have read the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. It is a fantasy series, it is marketed as YA, and there are a lot of sexual scenes in the series. I have to say that I was not surprised to see explicit sexual scenes in this book, because I already knew they were going to be there. So I was not surprised. But if I didn't know about it, I would have definitely been surprised, because it's a YA novel. And you know, you're not expecting an explicit sexual scene in a YA novel. I definitely feel like they're marketing these books wrong. I feel like they should at least warn the reader that there are going to be these scenes in it, you know, like a warning before a movie or a video. And for what concerns rape, I do not like it less if I find it in a book, but it has to be written well. And I also feel like they shouldn't be excluded from fantasy worlds, because even though it's not a real world, it has real things in it, you know, and it's not an ideal world by no means, because bad things happen in a fantasy world, in a fantasy book, and rape can happen. And as I said, I do not like it less, but it has to be written well, and it doesn't have to be, you know, romanticized and stuff like that. But it's definitely important to talk about it, you know? And I obviously think that we should talk more about these topics and not make it a taboo.
The reminder that she gave that fantasy is not an ideal genre, which we've heard from a couple of the other booktubers, is so important, because we tend to sometimes think fantasy is like a heaven, kind of this perfect place, but it isn't. Fantasy has its hardships as well. I mean, that's why there's a plot, because there's a problem. And I also really like what she said about, you know, needing to warn people about the content in books. I mean, we've seen this discussion already when it comes to whether books should have trigger warnings or not. Basically, they should, but I just agree from what she said, and also from what you guys have been saying in the comment section in my other videos, that there needs to be some type of content warning on the back of books so that readers know what they're getting, especially young adult, which has such a large age range. Having a content warning on the back like this has explicit scenes in it, this has very explicit scenes, or just like minor explicit scenes in a book, or on the back of a book, or on the inside of a book after the title page, could be so beneficial. You could put it where you put trigger warnings, for example. I would love to see that done in young adult. publishers take note. I just wanted to recommend you to read The V-Girl by Maya Roberts one more time, because I just feel like this one really embodies all of the themes that we have been talking about across these 3 videos very well, and it's such an underrated book and I think more people should read it. If you have read it, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Make sure you check out those other booktubers channels, all linked down below. You should definitely subscribe to them too. Please comment down below with your thoughts. Do you agree or disagree with anything that we've said in this video? And if you can, recommend me one book that you think handles the topics of either rape or handles explicit scenes in a realistic and very good way. I am always looking for recommendations. And that is it. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Hit the subscribe button if you want to see more. And of course, hit that notification bell if you want to be updated every time I have a new video. I'll see you guys in the next one, and thanks for joining along. Goodbye.